This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing, or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, because of a legislative development this week, we need to revisit the subject that we've talked about in a couple of prior episodes. Specifically in Episode 3, entitled Self-Censoring Public, and in Episode 7, entitled What Are They Doing?, we talked about transgender females, persons who were born biological males but identify as female, competing against biological females in athletic contests. In Episode 3, I reported on high school track championships in Connecticut, where two transgender females dominated sprints, and in Episode 7, I talked about a transgender female who defeated biological females in a cycling event. In the cycling event, the transgender female who won, Rachel McKinnon, labeled those who criticized her being allowed to compete against biological women as, quote, transphobic bigots, close quote. But my favorite quote from her, which really reveals her dismissive attitude towards biological women who are genuinely concerned about the unfairness of allowing transgender women with the biological advantages of men to compete against biological women, is this one. Ms. McKinnon said, quote, "It's not the case that all trans women are these 6-foot-tall, 200-pound powerlifters. I happen to be a 6-foot-tall, 200-pound powerlifter, but that's beside the point." Close quote. Now, as I've said in prior episodes, I have the utmost sympathy for individuals who are transgender. I can't imagine what it's like to go through life believing that you're in the wrong body. Having said that, when it comes to participation in sports, we should not let that sympathy get in the way of the obvious, logical, scientific conclusion that biological males have an advantage over biological females in athletic contests that involve strength, speed, or endurance. That's the reason why there are separate male and female sporting contests to begin with. That reason doesn't change simply because an individual athlete who is biologically male identifies as a female. And the failure to recognize that represents a threat to the future of women's athletics. As I have said, I've been a supporter of women's athletics since I was a kid, especially women's basketball. My high school won the girls' state basketball championship, and I was there in the stands to see it. I was always a fan of the Lady Vols and their legendary coach, Pat Summitt. She was one of the most successful coaches in any sport at any level, and she recognized the differences between men and women. Pat Summitt supported the proposal to reduce the size of the ball used for women's basketball. That reduced size, 1 inch smaller in circumference than the men's ball, took effect in the NCAA in 1984. Some people didn't like the size reduction and thought it diminished the image of women's basketball. When questioned why she supported reducing the size of the ball, Pat Summitt had a simple, straightforward, logical response, that it was a good idea because women's hands tend to be smaller than men's. I wish the persons who support biological males who identify as female competing against biological females were as logical as Pat Summitt. Incidentally, for anyone who assumes that Pat Summitt just automatically supported different rules for women's basketball, she testified as an expert witness in support of the Title IX lawsuit to force Tennessee high schools to abandon the 6-person women's team rule. That rule required that girls' teams consist of 3 forwards who played on one half of the court and could shoot baskets, and 3 guards who played on the other half and could not shoot baskets. That rule was a relic of days gone by, when people assumed that high school girls couldn't handle running the entire court. And Pat Summitt, to her credit, helped make sure that rule ended up in the dustbin. So, Why is this subject a hot topic again this week? Well, in the U.S. Congress, a bill has been filed that would mandate that all federally funded entities, including educational programs, school sports teams, women's shelters, and locker rooms at federally funded entities, interpret, quote, sex, close quote, to include, quote, gender identity, close quote. They would have to treat biological men as women if they identify as women, and biological women as men if they identify as men. Look to National Review in an article dated April 11, 2019, and entitled, "The Equality Act is About Coercion," for a discussion of the proposed legislation. The article was authored by the editors of National Review. One of the points made in the article is particularly concerning. Quote, "In the UK, the Ministry of Justice confirmed the findings of a women's rights group that more than 40% of prisoners identifying as transgender are registered sex offenders. The inquiry was conducted after a male rapist who self-identified as transgender sexually assaulted several female inmates," close quote. The article also notes that, quote, "Another troubling section of the Equality Act is its finding that conversion therapy is a form of discrimination. This is worrisome because the term conversion therapy, originally used to describe the controversial practice of trying to change a gay person's sexual orientation, is increasingly misapplied to tried, tested, and ethical treatments for gender-confused youth that range from counseling to watchful waiting. The Equality Act would set a dangerous precedent that could be interpreted to mandate doctors and therapists to pursue gender affirmation therapy, under which American girls as young as 13 and 14 have had their healthy breasts removed." Close quote. Finally, as the article notes, the legislation expressly prohibits using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to request exemptions from the Equality Act's requirements. Keep in mind that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was signed into law by Democrat President Bill Clinton in 1993, after having passed the House of Representatives unanimously and passed the Senate with only 3 senators voting against it. So you would think, given that nearly every Democrat in the House and Senate voted for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act when it passed in 1993, that it would be a hard sell to get Democrats to sign on to a bill which expressly prohibits the requirements of that act from being applied to a new mandate which certainly seems to be destined to cause huge conflicts with the consciences of religious practitioners, including many Christians. Well, apparently it wasn't such a hard sell. Per the Daily Wire's coverage of the bill on April 11, all except one House Democrat has already signed on to the bill, plus at least 2 Republicans. For anybody who thinks that the Democrat Party has not moved dramatically to the left since the days of Bill Clinton, think about the fact that in the days of Bill Clinton, the party that was part of a unanimous effort in the House to protect religious liberty has now reached the point where all except one member of that same party in the House has endorsed a bill which expressly prevents application of the law intended to protect religious liberty. Wow. So how could a transgender rights bill that doesn't exclude application of its mandate to women's sports, where biological males who identify as females clearly have an advantage in any contest involving strength, speed, or stamina, garner such overwhelming support? Well, it isn't just a transgender rights bill. It's a gay rights bill as well, and it extends to all public accommodations as well as the federally funded programs. And that represents a huge problem. There's widespread support for gay rights, and that support doesn't exist only on the Democrat side of the fence. By mixing transgender rights with gay rights, the bill has dramatically increased the likelihood of the transgender provisions being adopted, and has made it significantly more difficult for elected officials to oppose the bill for fear of being labeled as homophobic. And it has dramatically increased the potential for support from public organizations. Per MetroWeekly.com, companies that have announced their support for the bill include Adobe Systems, American Airlines, Apple, Bank of America, Coca-Cola, Corning, Cox Enterprises, Dow Chemical, eBay, Facebook, IBM, Kaiser Permanente, Kellogg Company, Marriott International, Target, Twitter, Under Armour, Wells Fargo, and Yelp, among others. The Daily Wire predicts that when the bill reaches the Senate, it won't get to a floor vote. It will remain stuck in committee. I suspect the Daily Wire is right on that point. But frankly, the fact that the bill will even pass the House and reach the Senate is reason for a great deal of concern. That's far too close to a point where religious freedom is pushed to the wayside and the potential destruction of women's sports is viewed as an acceptable price to pay for advancement of transgender rights. Next topic. Treatment of the First Lady and the Secretary of Homeland Security by the press and the left. While we're on the subject of women, I want to take just a moment to talk about probably the best evidence that the Trump administration has not been given a fair shake by the media, celebrities, and public personas in America. Think for a moment about the extent to which you've seen Melania Trump posing on the cover of fashion or news magazines. It virtually never happens. She's stunningly gorgeous. She actually was a fashion model. Yet since her husband was elected president, she's appeared on virtually no magazine covers. Is there any doubt that the reason is political? Anna Wintour of Vogue magazine, which had Melania on its cover in 2005 when she married Donald Trump, implied that the reason she has not been on the cover since her husband's election was because of his politics. If you go back to April 7, 2018, you'll find a tweet from the actor James Woods that gets right to the point. Quote, "If the Trumps were Democrats, Melania would be on every cover of every chic women's magazine in the world every month." Close quote. He's right on point, and he's probably exaggerating only slightly. It is wrong to punish the families of our presidents. If you have a substantive objection to the program of a First Lady, such as objecting to the changes in school vending machine food pushed by Michelle Obama, then fine, object away. But refusing to place them on magazine covers because you object to the policies being pursued by their spouse? Come on! We should all be able to respect the president's family and the office of the president, even if we don't like the president himself. And the only thing more objectionable than attacking or punishing the president's spouse because you don't like the president is attacking the president's minor child. Those who have publicly attacked Barron Trump, such as Peter Fonda, who said that the 12-year-old should be placed in a cage with pedophiles, have absolutely no excuse. Perhaps the most disturbing point is that he will likely face no negative impact on whatever career he has left. But Melania Trump is being punished. And if the left has its way, she won't be the only woman punished. Until April 10, Kirstjen Nielsen was the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now that she's no longer part of the administration, a group called Restore Public Trust is pressuring companies not to hire her. Per the Washington Post, in an article dated April 10 by Felicia Sonmez, entitled, "As Trump Pushes Kirstjen Nielsen Out the Door, Liberal Groups Try to Prevent a Soft Landing." The group Restore Public Trust sent letters to Fortune 500 company CEOs and took out an ad in the New York Times with the message, quote, "Attention, corporate America, don't let hate into your boardroom," close quote. Think for a moment about what Restore Public Trust and other groups are trying to do. I've talked in the past about those on the left trying to increase the price of supporting Donald Trump by imposing penalties, whether in the form of lost jobs, inability to eat out at restaurants because of being confronted by screaming leftists, or threats to actual safety because of the activity of aggressive leftists. The results of those activities are that people self-censor. They don't say what they mean or what they think for fear of the reaction of the left. They don't wear Trump-supporting gear even if they want to. As we've discussed, all of that is bad because it prevents people in a free society from knowing what their fellow Americans really think. And it makes living in America feel like something other than living in a free society. But what organizations like Restore Public Trust are doing is different and in some ways worse. Restore Public Trust is trying to prevent numerous members of the Trump administration from finding jobs after they leave the administration. If they succeed, what will be the effect? The effect will be that they will have discouraged some Americans from being willing to take jobs in the Trump administration. Don't forget, Donald Trump is the President of the United States. He's the head of the executive branch of government. If you can't find suitably qualified people to fill open positions in the executive branch, the country suffers. We all suffer. What Restore Public Trust is doing is bad for the country and should be called out as such. Every member of the media should be bringing this point home, regardless of whether they're on the left or the right. Do I think the media outlets on the left will do so? Nope. Absolutely not. Next topic. The Best of Enemies. This past week I saw the movie The Best of Enemies. I checked in advance and saw that it received a Rotten Tomatoes score of 52%, which placed it in the rotten category. Now, I've questioned in the past the advisability of relying on Rotten Tomatoes scores, especially in circumstances where there's some political angle to the film where it diverges from politically correct viewpoints. I also checked CinemaScore, which I personally think is the better source for movie rankings, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. However, when I checked, I couldn't find a ranking for Best of Enemies on CinemaScore. The storyline of the movie is revealed in the trailer when it shows a black political activist in the 60s participating on a team with the head of the local Ku Klux Klan to try to resolve how to provide schooling in the community after the school used by African American children was severely damaged in a fire. Now that's a pretty bizarre storyline, but what shocked me and made me interested in the movie was that it was based on a true story. So I was struggling with whether to go see the film when I read that the movie was getting pushback from the left from those who questioned the idea of a KKK member redeeming himself or in any way helping an African American. When I read that, it reminded me of the criticism of the movie Green Book, another film based on a true story and involving a white man with racist beliefs, redeeming himself and, in the process, befriending and assisting the black man. In that film, both men help each other and are better for their relationship. Green Book ended up justifiably winning the Oscar for Best Picture, and it remains the best film I've seen in a long time. So that convinced me to go see The Best of Enemies. That's right, objections from some on the left are what convinced me the movie might be worth seeing. I suspect I'm not the only one that has started to react that way to criticisms from the left. The Best of Enemies stars Taraji P. Henson as Ann Atwater, an African-American civil rights activist, and Sam Rockwell as C.P. Ellis, a local KKK leader. The two are named as co-chairs of a community task force called a charrette to determine whether to integrate the local schools, in part to address facility shortages caused by damage from a major fire at a local black school. Both lead actors perform well in their roles. Sam Rockwell seems to be making a pretty good living recently playing racists, given that he played the racist deputy in 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Now, one of the things that may upset some people is that the character C.P. Ellis is humanized fairly early on in the film. He isn't played from the start as universally evil. And that is a bit of a hard thing to take, given what we are talking about is the head of the local branch of a domestic terrorist organization. In this case, part of the humanizing effect comes from the fact that C.P. Ellis had a child with severe developmental disabilities. So as hard as it is to sympathize with anybody with his racist beliefs, it wasn't hard to sympathize with his struggles as a parent trying to help and comfort his son as he lives through such severe problems. I'm about to reveal a huge plot point from this movie, so spoiler alert. In the end, C.P. Ellis's interaction with Anne Atwater and his participation in the charrette changed him. The movie depicted him doing something so shocking for a KKK leader that immediately after I came home from the theater, I went to the website History vs. Hollywood to look into whether it actually happened as the film depicted. Sure enough, it did. At the end of the charrette, in a public auditorium, C.P. Ellis tore up his KKK card on the stage. It really happened, and Ellis received death threats for doing so. Moreover, Ellis and Atwater remained friends for the rest of their lives. Based on what History vs. Hollywood had to say about the film, my conclusion is that it is a much more accurate depiction of actual events than is typical of a Hollywood film that's based on actual events. Contrary to the pushback from some on the left, this movie is well worth seeing. If you have kids, I recommend you take them so that they can see a real-life story of someone driven by hate, seeing the error of his ways, and redeeming himself. That aspect of the film alone is enough to warrant bringing the family. Am I saying this film is on par with Green Book? No, I'm not. This film was good. Green Book was great, and as I noted, deserved the Academy Award for Best Picture. So what exactly is the site that I recommend for film rankings instead of Rotten Tomatoes? And before I give that recommendation, let me reiterate that I don't receive any consideration of any kind from any film ranking sites. The site that I recommend is CinemaScore. The site polls the moviegoers who attend the opening nights of films and has them provide a ranking from A to F, including plus and minus levels. The key to using CinemaScore is to factor in that these rankings come from people who choose to attend the opening nights of films. As a result, they tend to be disproportionately likely to give the films positive ratings because they're fans of the film series, if it's part of a series, or its stars, or its genre. Therefore, CinemaScore rankings tend to be top-heavy to say the least. If the film gets a C or even a C+, there's a good chance it's absolutely horrible. So basically, you're looking for films that are rated B+ and above. If the film gets an A+, A, or A-, you're probably good to go. If it gets a B+, it's on the borderline, but probably worth the risk. Once you get down to a B, you're really in matinee or streaming service territory. B- and below, it's hard to believe you'll like it. Now, I make this recommendation of CinemaScore with one caveat. If the movie is not something that you would typically want to see, for example, if somebody is trying to convince you to go and you're saying to yourself, I usually don't like those kinds of movies, then you really have to be careful relying on CinemaScore. Because the people giving those rankings on the opening nights of the films are the types of people that usually do like those kinds of movies. In that instance, CinemaScore might not be the best site for you. Hopefully you consider Political Spirits the best podcast for you, and I'll do my best to keep it that way. I look forward to speaking with you next week when I release the next episode. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits. And remember to tell your friends in other states, too, and follow me on Twitter @Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.